Right, well, welcome. I hope you all are safe and well. My name is Tom Piahuda. I'm the Vice President for Research here at Chapman University. We are certainly living in extraordinary times right now, and this week has been one of those weeks, certainly. With the news last night of the President and First Lady testing positive for COVID-19, we certainly are keeping them in our thoughts and prayers, and we hope they get well soon. But we're here today for our next Ask the Expert panel that has become very popular over the last few months here. Today's topic really needs no introduction. It's the election 2020. We were really thrilled to have an excellent panel here of Chapman experts from really a diverse group of backgrounds. And I'm really thrilled that they were able to agree to join us. This is meant to be really an interactive format. So I encourage you all to ask questions through our Q&A portion of the boxes. You can fill it in there. It's called Q&A. Please post questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So with that, let's get started. I'm not gonna be moderating today. I'm really thrilled to introduce our moderator, who's Professor Jennifer Keene. She's a professor in history and Dean of the Wilkinson College of Arts and Humanities and Social Sciences, affectionately known as the heart and soul of Chapman. She is a well-published expert on American history, including the 1918 pandemic, which is very timely. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Keene to moderate our panel today. Thank you, Professor Keene.
Great, thanks, Tom. It's really a pleasure to be here, to be back at an Ask the Experts session. I was here earlier in the pandemic to talk about the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. And today I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to moderate a conversation on issues in the 2020 election. Needless to say, it's probably an understatement to say that it's been quite a busy week when it comes to focusing on the issues in the election, thinking what is going to be the most important issue, what's really going to affect the outcome of the election. I just want to preface our discussion by pointing out that we are really not trying to predict the outcome election in this conversation. What we want to do is turn to the experts that we have on our faculty to help us better understand the issues that have been discussed, have been important. And while the president's health is obviously in the forefront of everyone's minds today, we want to, and we will get to that, we also want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about the numerous other issues that have been important and have been discussed, because these are issues that give us insight into the election, but also into American society, into shifts in American society. And I think the expertise that we have really helps us develop a more robust understanding of ourselves, where we've been and where we're going. So I'm going to start with introducing the panel, and then this format, the format of this Ask the Experts is a little different. We're not going to have individual presentations. We're going to have a discussion. I'll be asking some directed questions of each participant, and then we're going to open it up to a more general conversation, and then, of course, make sure that we have enough time for questions from the audience. Okay, so let me introduce our panelists. So first, I'd like to introduce Joel Kochkin. He's a presidential fellow in urban futures at Chapman University and executive director of the Urban Reform Institute. He has written widely on the social and political impacts of COVID, particularly about the impact on cities, and has a new book out just now, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, A Warning from the Global Middle Class. Our next panelist is Lori Cox Han, who is a professor of political science in Wilkinson College. Her research and teaching expertise include the presidency, women in politics, and media and politics. She is the author of numerous books, and I'm going to just mention two: Presidents and the American Presidency, Women, Power, and Politics, The Fight for Gender Equality in the United States, and In It to Win, Electing Madam President. I really like that one. The next panelist is Dr. Carissa Threet, who is an associate professor of history in Wilkinson College, where she teaches courses in United States and African American history. Her research interests are in race and gender in 20th century U.S. history, civil rights, community activism, and civil military relations. Next up is Chris Bader. He is a professor in the Department of Sociology and the Campbell Professor of Behavioral Science. He is one of the principal investigators of the Chapman University Survey of American Fears, an annual survey project that asks a random sample of Americans about their greatest fears. I feel like that's such a timely research project for our moment. And finally, John Compton is an associate professor and chair of the political science department. His teaching and research interests include American political development, constitutional law, and religion and politics. And his most recent book is The End of Empathy: Why White Protestants Stop Loving Their Neighbors. So I think you can see just from these short introductions the expertise that this panel has and how they really have the capability to speak to us on a range of topics that have indeed been important in the 2020 election. So I'm going to get started with our conversation, and the first question is going to go to Lori Cox Han. So Lori, we created this question yesterday when it seemed to be the most important question, and now today it doesn't seem like the most important question, but I think we still need to ask it, which is about presidential debates and the role that debates traditionally have played in presidential elections. And thinking about the debate on Tuesday, how does what happened help us understand this history of presidential debates in presidential politics?
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Tom, for putting together this series. So 3 nights ago, we had a presidential debate, and right about now, that seems about maybe 3 months ago because so much has happened in less than 72 hours. And just in general, for the last few campaign cycles, I've been making the argument that perhaps presidential debates had outlived their usefulness. They're really nothing more than political theater. They're not substantive events where voters really get a lot of good information. And political science research has never shown that debates really make much of a difference in terms of voter attitudes. But we had not seen any debate like we saw on Tuesday. So I do think, though, that Tuesday's night debate perhaps made my point for me about how maybe we should rethink this entire format. And at this point in the general election, the thing that's most important for the candidates, and I say this in general without taking into account the breaking news that we've been seeing for the last day, is the campaign narrative that is put out there and how that can relate to voter turnout and what will happen on election day. And so the challenge for both the Trump and the Biden campaigns right now is they're each trying to go beyond their base to reach to any swing voters who may still be undecided. You know, polling is showing that there aren't that many undecided voters. I always tend to think that it's more about people who have yet to decide whether or not they're even going to bother to vote, as opposed to who they might be supporting. And in terms of the polls, I would just say, remember 2016, that they weren't all that accurate. I don't know what polling is like in the middle of a pandemic. I think we're about to find out in the next few weeks. So, we do have 2 more presidential debates coming up. I'm not sure what that will look like. They may be, virtual if they're on Zoom. I think that addresses the point that many people have been making the last few days, whether or not you can mute someone or turn off a mic. So that might, take care of that problem right there. We do have a vice presidential debate coming up on Tuesday or Wednesday, I think it's Tuesday, and where Kamala Harris will take the center stage for the Democrats against Vice President Mike Pence. And while running mates really matter only at the margins, I think that this debate will be interesting because I predict that it will be a substantive debate, a calmer discussion. Mike Pence's style is certainly about not really anything like the president's. And so Kamala Harris will also have an opportunity to really show the next generation of leadership for the Democratic Party. So I think that if it is a calmer, more substantive conversation, it might be a chance for the nation to almost kind of take a deep breath a little bit and reassess where we are in this campaign. But, in debates in general, I think that we might need to move past that in terms of how the rest of the conversation in this campaign moves forward. It's really anybody's guess. We're kind of changing not only by the day, but by the hour. So we'll just have to stay tuned in and watch.
That's right, for sure. Great. Thanks so much, Lori. All right, so Chris, I think if you don't mind, we'll turn to you next. And I wanted to ask you, obviously the pandemic has always been on our minds throughout this entire process, never more so than today. And so I wanted to ask you about the previous research that the Fear Survey has done on pandemics. I should just maybe let everybody know that you haven't been able to do specific research conducted on COVID-19 because of the difficulties of doing research in this moment. But you have done research on pandemics and how people feel about them. What does your previous research focusing on fear suggest about how people are reacting to the pandemic?
And really, there's been nothing that's happened in 2020 that suggests my 2019 data shouldn't be perfectly applicable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's sort of like exactly the same, right?
Very calm,
non-eventful.
Well, what we have seen that I think tells us about this moment or gives us some insight into this moment is that we've been asking about pandemics for the last 6 waves of the Chapman University Survey of American Fears, and it always shows up as one of the top fears. To be clear, since our last survey was conducted in a pre-COVID world, we're asking about pandemics in general, not COVID-19. But about half of Americans expressed great fear about pandemics in previous surveys. So this is something that is on Americans' minds. They see pandemics as something that should be of a higher level of concern than clowns and vampires and heights and even a lot of other issues. People fear pandemics more than they fear losing their jobs. So it is something that people were afraid of before COVID, which tells me that it will impact people's thinking in the COVID era. And the people who fear COVID the most really interest me in terms of what our political scientists on the panel might say about voting is they are the most vulnerable populations. That basically people who are of racial and ethnic minorities, people who have lower levels of income, lower levels of education, they're the people who say they're the most afraid of pandemics. And are also the people who say they're most afraid of losing their jobs, losing a loved one due to illness, not being able to pay their medical bills. So that tells me, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, is that vulnerable populations are going to be especially afraid during this time. And where that's important to what might happen in the election is that vulnerable populations actually indicate that they are much more afraid of what's going to happen in the 2020 election. And we have seen over the years that people who say they're afraid about the upcoming election are more likely to indicate that they will vote. However, let me have a caveat that's because someone says they're going to vote doesn't mean they're going to. It's one of the most over-reported things, voting, that along with church attendance. Seems like everyone's voting right after they go to church on Sunday. So what that means is certainly attitudinally, we're seeing that people are afraid of pandemics. They have been for a long time. And those fears tend to correlate with people who also say that they are afraid and motivated to vote in the election. So I think that's where COVID could really play into what we're going to see.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. All right, Joel, we'll kind of come over to you and build on that a little bit by thinking about the spaces in which people are actually inhabiting. And, you know, in addition to generalized fears of COVID and Chris kind of suggesting that certain communities can have, you know, a heightened fear versus other communities. We have seen the suburbs sort of play out in this election as well. The idea of the sort of suburban mom being a toss-up vote, something that both sides can kind of hope to attract. And I'm wondering about our historical conceptions of the suburbs, how that matches with the reality of the suburbs today, and how this kind of aspect of Americans occupying different class categories. So not just being maybe divided by gender or race or ethnicity, but really the fact that we do have class stratification in the United States as well. How do you feel like that is potentially factoring into the election?
Well, I think the main thing, first of all, is to recognize that the suburbs have not been remotely as hard hit as the inner city. We have all the numbers to prove that, but the fears are still there. People are worried, you know, their kids are going to come back from school. They're worried about infecting, you know, grandma. So I think that this is a pretty generalized concern. The bottom line is the suburbs will decide who wins and who doesn't win. The countryside has become increasingly conservative, pretty reliably Republican in most places. There are some exceptions, but generally not. And the cities have, you know, vote now Democratic 80, 90% in some cases. So it's almost like the Soviet Union. I mean, it's just the only big constituency, which is about over half the electorate, is in the suburbs. And they vary back and forth. President Obama did fairly well in the suburbs, much better than Hillary Clinton. That's why that's one of the reasons he won. So that's where the election is going to be won or lost, particularly the suburbs in about 6 or 7 states. What we're seeing right now is I think Biden will do reasonably well. I think, Trump has alienated, when they talk about the suburban mom may have a job. The suburban mom may be African-American. The suburban mom might be Latino, might be Asian. And so this notion of the, sort of the white soccer mom, remember from the Bill Clinton era, that's become really antiquated. The vast majority of the growth in the suburbs is minorities. And it's very varied. There are suburbs that are working class and poor. There are suburbs that are very wealthy. There are ones in the middle. But at the end of the day, the election will be decided in the suburbs. And right now, from what we're seeing and what people on the ground are telling me, right now, Biden is probably going to get at least 50% of the suburban vote. If he gets that, it's over.
Okay, thank you so much there. All right, so for John and Carissa, we're gonna kind of turn to some sort of larger social movement questions. And John, I'm going to start with you, where again, a week ago, I think we would have been starting with you, not getting to you fourth, when we consider the vacancy on the Supreme Court and the role, especially that evangelical Protestants are playing in the Supreme Court nominee from President Trump, and the way that this has really pushed religion back into the spotlight as an issue in the election in a way that, say, it wasn't about a month ago. And I think this it connects very well to the book that you've published, and I wonder if you can kind of pull a little bit on some of that research to help us understand the link between religion and politics in this election, and also in American presidential elections in general.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great, very timely question. There's a huge interest right now in white evangelicals as a constituency. And, you mentioned that I just published this book, and looking at the competition, I think there have been probably 20 other books published on more or less the same topic in the last 6 months or so.
We don't care about those, though. We only care about yours. So.
Oh, well, yeah. It's more competition than would be ideal. But so there's this huge interest, and you can sort of see why, because it's arguably the largest single constituency within the Republican Party. And the conventional story about 2016 is that evangelicals weren't really thrilled with Trump as a potential nominee. They tended to like people like Ted Cruz. And so Trump really had to win them over by coming out and being strongly pro-life, and by releasing this list of federal judges that he would appoint if he were elected. And so gradually he won them over, and then they voted for him with, to the tune of 80% in the general election. And so ever since then, there have just been countless articles and books asking, well, what are white evangelicals going to do in 2020? Are they going to stick with Trump? Are they going to abandon him for, some of his various misdeeds or whatever? My take on this is that I think white evangelicals are actually vastly overrated as an electoral constituency. And the reason I say that is I think that religion is just a much less important explanatory variable for political behavior than it was 40 or 50 years ago. And more generally, I think there's been a kind of collapse of religious authority in American society. So if we turn the clock back 50 or 60 years, it was very true that, if you're a Catholic in 1960, you're voting for JFK. Religion is very important. Even if we look at Protestants, there are certain episodes where Protestant religious leaders come out and they strongly adopt a position on something. In the North, for example, in 1964, the mainline Protestant leaders came out for the Civil Rights Act, and they were very influential, as I show using some public opinion data in the book. They were very influential in moving white opinion on the Civil Rights Act. Today, religious authority just does not exist like that, particularly in the white evangelical community. So what's more important? I think this sort of ties into what Joel was saying, I think. I would view class as the much more important explanatory variable than religion today. So if you look at Trump's vote shares in 2016, he won 80% of the white evangelical vote, but he won, about 68, 70% of the non-college white vote. White evangelicals are overwhelmingly non-college whites, or not overwhelmingly, but it's the least educated of the major religious groups. And if you look at public opinion trends over the last 30, 40 years, white evangelicals basically track the non-college white view on most issues. Or to put that another way, non-college whites have trended together regardless of religious affiliation. So I view class as the much more important explanatory variable. And, I could give more examples of that, but the one place where I think religion does matter is if we move away from just talking about self-identification, as in, what are you? And someone says, I'm an evangelical. If you look at church attendance does matter. It does have an effect above and beyond class, but the effect's not huge. And then when you really zoom in on church attendance and just look at weekly church attenders, and let's say even white evangelical weekly church attenders, if you look at what drives their voting behavior, it's more likely, or I should say the effect is larger for issues like immigration, race and civil rights. Those issues actually have more explanatory weight than abortion or the more traditional, what we call, what they would call moral issues. So sort of tying it back into the Supreme Court nomination, that's when the vacancy came, and Trump chose a nominee who's seen as very in tune with conservative religious voters. That was seen as possibly a game changer in the election somehow. But again, my view is, if you're a conservative religious voter, you were already voting for Trump. I don't think that's in any sense going to have a major impact on the election at this point.
It is sort of interesting from a historical standpoint how Biden's Catholicism has been a non-issue in the campaign. And of course, if you think about, you mentioned JFK, it was exactly the opposite. It was also a reason people voted for him, but also a reason why people voted against him, and now it seems that it's I think I forgot Biden was a Catholic until because of the Supreme Court nominee. Catholicism suddenly came up for a day and a half. Also in a news cycle where we don't have one issue that's sort of dominating there. Great, thanks. Okay, so Carissa, we'll just come to you before we open it up. And again, an issue that is important, always important in American society, racial injustice and discrimination in the United States. When we think back to the conventions and we think about that as a moment where the Black Lives Matter, the protests, that this was something in the forefront of everyone's minds, and I think is still a critical issue in this campaign. And I wondered if you could maybe help us with situating the Black Lives Matter movement in sort of the long history of the civil rights movement in the United States. In other words, there is a long history, obviously, of activism and of militancy in the drive for civil rights for African Americans and racial justice. And it seems to me that sometimes when we think about the Black Lives Matter, we're kind of very presentist in sort of how we understand the issues that are being articulated. So can you help shed some light on this? Give us a little bit of historical perspective on this movement.
I also wanted to start by saying thank you for including me on this panel. I would say first to begin with that we are living in an incredible moment that is kind of coincided with this really intense period of racial upheaval that we haven't seen in a generation. But it's like you said, it's also, it's too easy to think that this is coming out of nowhere and it's brand new. The strategies that the Black Lives Matter movement are certainly new in their form in the current period, but the issues that they've been talking about are not. Issues such as economic inequalities, housing insecurity, police intimidation, violence against people of color. These are issues that have had a long history in this country. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, I would argue, is really part of a legacy of Black militancy and protest that really looks to unmask the simmering racial tensions that we often forget about. And also in this particular moment, I would say, I think, after the election of Obama, there was this kind of understanding that, or a belief that we were in a post-racial society because we had this president, this person of color. But organizations and movements like Black Lives Matter help to kind of raise the kind of ongoing issues with racial tensions. Black Lives Matter and other organizations like this historically have also pushed an agenda and really tried to force the country to deal with and confront ending discrimination, institutional racism, and inequalities in American society. And I think if we look, I mean, we certainly can look at the pre-20th century, but if we look just in the 20th century, we can definitely make connections if we think about global pandemics, racial tensions. We can really look to the early part of the 20th century, particularly Wilson's presidency, in which we are coming off a major world war. We are also dealing with a Spanish influenza and the flu pandemic of 1918. But Wilson himself and his administration was an administration that really, when he was elected in 1912, brought forth an administration that largely supported kind of a national agenda in which African Americans were not only continuing to be politically disenfranchised, but when you also see African Americans, particularly a middle class of African Americans, who are dealing with professional and economic disenfranchisement as well. And so we can kind of draw some parallels here, but in response to that, we see an uptick in African-American militancy and participation in activist protest throughout the late 19-teens and 1920s. So we can see that, you know, in response to a greater kind of focus on a particular white supremacist agenda, there's always been, throughout at least the 20th century, Black racial protest that's responding to that. And we can, you know, also if we go forward post-World War II into the 1950s and the 1960s, also responding to some of the disadvantages and ongoing racial tensions, really pushing both the candidates and larger American society to confront racism without having to kind of push it aside as well. So I would say that in thinking about the Black Lives Matter, I think it's really important for us to think about the large kind of legacy of ongoing racial protests and racial militancy that African Americans and other people of color and their white allies have continuously forced American society to confront both their history and their current moment as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we've been thinking a lot about the parallels between the COVID moment and the flu pandemic of 1918, but you're drawing some great parallels for us about also the civil rights movement and the way that, you know, certain administrations, you can feel like, you know, in America, things just always get better, but in fact, it can be more of a wave pattern. Where we can see that there can be changes put into place. I mean, maybe just to build on that a little bit, you know, with Woodrow Wilson coming in and allowing the federal government to resegregate its offices. So actually a step back from integration at that particular historical moment. Yeah, this is dangerous terrain for us because I also work on this moment. So we could completely turn this into a World War I 1918 conversation, which I'm going to stop myself from doing, but to maybe now pull us all back together. And we're starting to see some questions coming in. One of the things that we did decide at the last minute we needed to add, given today's events and the news that we're all sort of, you know, anxiously following, that maybe what we really need right now is a refresher course in the 25th Amendment. So I'm going to turn to Lori and John to maybe help us understand a little bit about that in terms of giving, at this moment, even understanding with a president being ill, potentially seriously ill, how besides the election, how does the government keep going? What might this mean for the election? I think this is on a lot of people's minds today.
Yeah, so you know, I was just looking at the image of Trump walking from the White House onto Marine One. So that's one of the images that's going out worldwide, I'm sure, right now. And to allay any fears that anyone might have about whether the election is actually going to go forth, yes, it will. It will not be postponed in any way, but it's going to certainly change the nature of the campaign. And so imagine Trump, instead of doing his rallies now, you know, the campaign's already announced that he will be doing virtual events instead. I think there's a lot of tension right now whether or not he will actually speak to the nation at any point, and I think that will be important. I think it will depend on, obviously, how he's he's doing, and he may do something while he's at Walter Reed. We don't really know the details. We're at the mercy of just knowing the information that the government is giving to us right now. But given that he's going to be under observation at Walter Reed, there are any number of ways you can read that. There are any number of conspiracy theories that are already circulating. So I would just say, just take a lot of that, especially on social media, with a grain of salt at this point. And we just need to see how it continues to play out. In terms of the 25th Amendment, I mean, it is there for a reason. It is there to protect against, if there is a presidential disability, then there's a chain of command, line of succession that kicks in. And so obviously, if under this circumstance or any other, if the president is not able to fulfill his duties, then the cabinet basically takes a vote and submits it to Congress if they think the vice president needs to step in and be acting president. And then in this case, Mike Pence would be acting president until the cabinet members again take a vote to say, okay, the president now can resume duties. Beyond that, in terms of presidential succession, it's clearly outlined both in the Constitution and the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. Of it goes from president to vice president to Speaker of the House, the President pro tem of the Senate, and then to each cabinet position in terms of when that cabinet was created. So first in line is Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, on down the line. So last in line right now would be the Secretary of Homeland Security, who is actually an acting secretary. So, I don't think we even need to worry about that. But that's basically where we're at in terms of 25th Amendment, line of succession. And I think people are just curious, what does this mean for the campaign? I think that, it's just going to be in a different format. And the world has already gotten used to as much as we can in terms of communicating via Zoom. I mean, we're all teaching online. So this is going to be certainly probably more of a challenge for the Trump campaign right now than the Biden campaign. But I think we're just going to have to take the rest of this campaign one day at a time.
Great. I just want to remind everybody who's watching that you can post questions in the Q&A part of your screen. And so we're going to be turning to audience questions just in a minute. So if you have some questions, please feel free to post them. Okay, John, did you want to say anything about the 25th Amendment, or?
I don't really have much to add beyond what Lori said, other than just it does seem like people have been very aware of the 25th Amendment for the past 4 years. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of articles written, et cetera. So I think we're maybe in a little better place than in 1981 when Reagan was assassinated, and there was all this confusion. I think it was Al Haig who declared that he was in charge, despite being like fourth in line. So I think we're a little more clear on the lines of succession at this point, and people seem up to speed on what would happen.
Right, great. Okay. All right. So before we turn to the audience questions, I just wanted to give the panel a chance. If you felt there were any sort of issues you really want to make sure that we had a chance to mention in this conversation. I think one kind of interesting point is, again, at the beginning of the week, we were talking about Trump's taxes. And I think I'm wondering about a little bit about the class dimension of that in terms of the Wall Street versus Main Street kind of notion here. Does anybody have anything they want to say about that particular issue? I mean, there's many more. I don't want to. I've been directing the conversation sort of up to this point, so I want to sort of open it up a little bit for you. But maybe just one last go around of things we haven't mentioned yet, and then we'll turn to the audience questions.
Just to go really quickly on the class issue and taxes, what's one of the great ironies of this election is you have a guy who is a mogul, although I think if I was an accountant, I would probably think that he should go to debtor's prison, but that's not for me to say. But what's very interesting is that and this has been happening over years, is the Democratic Party is becoming the party of the very wealthy. I mean, if you look at where are the tech people putting their money, where are the Wall Street people putting their money, oddly enough, you would think that they would be beneficiaries of taxes policy of Trump, but they are so turned off by him for lots of different reasons, some of them business reasons, that the wealthy are actually becoming, pretty consistent Democrats. Most of the wealthiest congressional districts are pretty solidly Democratic now. So, class is an issue, but it sometimes expresses itself in surprising ways.
Great. Okay, well, let's turn to some of the questions here. If nobody has anything else that they want to bring up here, we have a question in here about the media and the media's role in presidential elections and politics, which I think is quite interesting here. And I mean, here, I'll just read the question here. Looking at party affiliations, it seems that the right side relies on one source, Fox News, while the left and/or everyone else has many sources. This seems to be why the right villainizes the media. How accurate is this assessment? I think that this is a good question, not just about, our particular media moment, but even thinking about the media in general in terms of presidential politics, and what messages different groups get depending on the media that they consume and the message that is given. So maybe I'll just throw this out to the panel, and anybody like to tackle that one?
I could say a little about that. But,
I'm not going to call on you because now it's not class. Now you have to just interrupt each other.
One thing I think we found interesting from the fear survey is that we found equal amounts of fear of a lot of issues, particularly political issues, when someone was watching MSNBC or when someone was watching Fox News. And I think the conclusion I really came away with that is, regardless of the fact that MSNBC more aligns with my personal political preferences, I still see it as very much slanted towards, it is an organization that's trying to show me what I want to see. And Fox is an organization that's trying to show its viewers what they want to see. And what I'm seeing in our surveys is levels of fear. I'm not talking about demonization and other issues, but at least levels of fear are equally there when you are watching left partisan news as right partisan news. And there's sort of this narrative out there that Fox is making everyone afraid. I think Fox is inaccurate for a lot of reasons, but they aren't making people any more afraid, I've found, than left-wing partisan media.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here too, that news right now is fragmented, it is hyper-partisan, and let's never forget that news is a market-driven commodity. It's about making money. So news organizations are targeting their key constituents, consumers, just like candidates are trying to, get their core voters out on election day. And there's not a lot of trust in the news media among the American public right now. We believe the things that we tend to agree with, and we don't want to hear any opposing viewpoints to that. And we've been in that kind of a media cycle for 15, 20 years now. I think it's getting more extreme. I don't really know the answer to that. I was just talking with my students yesterday about this issue, especially as it relates to the, not only elections, but just how we view our government. And that is, there's a big difference between news and journalism. And news is a consumer-driven product, and journalism is what voters in a representative democracy, deliberative democracy, need to be informed voters. And we have way too much news and not nearly enough journalism, and I'm really not sure how to, address that. I do think there's more of an appetite than most media organizations give the American public credit for, of actually wanting more substantive and objective news. But I'm not sure that the market is actually supporting that right now.
Yeah, and I would say that certainly the New York Times investigation into Trump's taxes was a piece of investigative journalism. Mm-hmm. They went to great lengths, in fact, to show their research and not just report the results, in terms of that. But there's not always a lot of that in terms of and of course, then do you trust the New York Times in terms of actually accurately,
And we can pretty much predict how those numbers would play out in terms of who trusts the New York Times and who doesn't. And then the reliance on any kind of anonymous reporting then just kind of feeds into the problem. Right. So, the news media does control an awful lot about the political environment. But I don't know how we're supposed to change that. I often tell students, if it wasn't for that darn First Amendment, maybe we could really make some serious reforms. And I'm not advocating against the First Amendment in any way, but it is problematic.
Great. Okay. Anybody else want to say anything about media? Go ahead, Joel, and we'll turn.
Well, I guess I'm, since I'm one person here has made his living as a journalist.
There you go.
So I am disgusted beyond belief, and the public is also disgusted beyond belief. Every survey that I look at, I just finished something on this actually, which is basically that people don't trust the media in general. They trust social media. Actually, in California, people trust the pod industry more than the social media, which I don't know what quite it says, but it says something. But what I find just is that I look at newspapers. My poor wife has to hear me say, where the hell was the editor? Didn't you even think that there was another side? Didn't you even think that maybe somebody might have a different point of view? And I think some of it is laziness. Some of it is the reporters are being indoctrinated when they're young in journalism schools. Not the way I was taught. One story I tell my students is when I was a young reporter at the Washington Post, when I did a story and I put my opinion in, and my editor, Dick Horowitz, wrote on the piece of paper, we had paper in those days, on the piece of paper, nobody gives a damn what you think. And that always stayed with me, that young reporters, they don't do the kind of like what I did. My first job's covering the Berkeley City Council and the Oakland City Council and, doing that kind of local stuff. Now what happens is many of the national journalists come right out of the graduate schools. Mm-hmm. They've had no grassroots experience. They have very little contact with regular voters, which is one of the reasons why I think they missed Trump the first time. And the only strategy I have anymore is to look at both sides and try to find the original source data, because I now have virtually no trust in most journalists today. And so the public isn't stupid.
And I think, again, I want to get to another question here, but it also seems that with the rise of social media, and we see the president's use of Twitter, that in fact, in even movement culture with Black Lives Matters, that, you can develop your own communication channels. It doesn't have to be mediated through sort of mainstream traditional media outlets. And that also changes the way, narratives are being created. Here's a question for John. I've heard that there may be a growing generational split within white evangelicals over climate change, with younger generation being resistant to Trump's view on climate change. Any insight into this? In other words, again, we kind of are categorizing a group based on their religious affiliation, but is there generational conflict within that affects politics?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and we do see a lot of data that evangelicals are not a monolith, and young evangelicals really break from older evangelicals on not just on climate change, but also on issues like same-sex marriage and LGBT rights and things like that. Not so much on abortion, but on a host of other issues. There is a real generational divide. And the other trend that I think is really showing up in the public opinion data is that younger people in general, including people raised as evangelicals, seem to be drifting away from that tradition in much larger numbers than they have in the past. And there's a lot of speculation about why this might be. There's some evidence that the kind of anti-Trump effect could be at work, in the sense that younger people tend to be more anti-Trump, and Trump has really, tied himself tightly to the evangelical community. But a lot of that evidence is pretty speculative at this point. But there's clearly a generational divide, and for the last few decades, evangelicals were always kind of the great exception to the larger trend of secularization in American society, right? The percentage of Catholics has shrunk, and Catholic religious attendance has shrunk over the last 30, 40 years. Mainline Protestants have, really shrunk over the last 30, 40 years, but evangelicals were always going strong until the last decade or so. And now there seems to be a kind of secularizing trend among people who were raised as evangelicals. So clearly something's happening. It's a little too early to say exactly why, but back to the original question, I think the generational split is very real.
Great, thank you. Here's another question here. The last two elections have had people voting for people or candidates they hate least. Are you seeing this as a future trend or an anomaly? And I think that's a great question, because kind of the question of, if are you voting pro-Biden, or are you anti-Trump? Are you pro-Trump, or are you anti-Biden? And even I think the the idea of say more left-leaning Democrats, progressive-oriented candidates, having to feel that they've had to compromise by even having Biden as a candidate. I mean, so what would you say about that what we're seeing, rather than strong enthusiasm for candidates, what we're seeing is people voting for the person that they dislike the least?
I'll take that question. I talk about this a lot. There's a disconnect between how we elect presidents and then what we expect in terms of governing. They are two completely different skill sets. And we've seen this problem for several decades now. I mean, this isn't the first time, or in 2016, it wasn't the first time that exit polls or other public opinion showed that people were really unhappy with both of the major party candidates. So this has been happening for a long time. I think we feel it even more now because, for example, in 2016, Trump was the least popular presidential candidate from a major party that we've ever seen. The problem was the second least popular candidate happened to be Hillary Clinton. She was slightly more popular than Donald Trump, but she was still upside down in terms of those numbers. Her negatives were just extremely high. And so here we are in 2020 with Trump as an incumbent, Biden, and a big enthusiasm gap, quite frankly, for Biden, especially among younger voters. They might agree with what he's saying, but they're not really excited about a 77-year-old man who's been in public life for 50 years, and they don't really represent where a lot of younger voters want the Democratic Party to go. So again, kind of coming back to Kamala Harris as his running mate, that helps a little bit, but probably not enough to really turn those numbers around for Biden. So I would certainly like to see American citizens feel better about who our choices are on the ballot, but we need to seriously reform, particularly the primary process in presidential elections first. But until we do that, we're just going to keep replicating this cycle. Maybe it'll be a little bit better in 2024 when Trump is not running for anything. But this is a problem, and it goes just beyond a superficial, fix.
Great. We've been thinking about generational divides. I mean, you've sort of brought that up, in terms of younger voters maybe not being so enamored with, 70 plus, white men as the main candidates. Chris, I wonder if we might bring you back into this conversation a little bit, because we're sort of earlier talking about Black Lives Matter almost as a kind of stand-in for the African-American community and African-American views on the election. But what do you see there now, or sort of historically, in terms of divides and debates within the Black community about how to best advance the cause through the political process or outside of the political process? I mean, are we seeing, Black Lives Matter gets a lot of the attention now, but what is the conversation? I mean, is there a similar sort of generational divide as, say, for example, we're seeing in the evangelical Protestant community? And
I was getting ready to hop in, so I'm actually,
it could be the same thing.
Right, I'm totally fine with you pushing me in, because I was getting ready to hop in right after Lori ended. But this is always really an interesting part of the conversation for a couple reasons. Historically, I think there's this assumption that the Black community writ large will vote Democratic, and therefore candidates don't have to work so hard. And we are seeing currently in this particular moment why that's problematic. Biden certainly is, in terms of the general African-American community, I think a good majority of them will support him, not necessarily because they love him. Particularly, he has his history behind him in terms of some of the language he's used in the past that he has not acknowledged, as well as things that he's voted on. But there's also a growing group of Black Republicans who very much do support Trump, who very much do point to some of his policies as being good for the Black community, and who, regardless of whether or not Trump has followed through, and you can see this, although we had this amazing RNC in which you had all of these African Americans all of a sudden pop up, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the actual, into actual candidate positions or administrative positions. It does highlight that that the African American community should not be thought of as a monolith. And when we talk about generational divides that Lori was pointing out, in terms of progressive politics, very much so that younger generation tends to tends to want to focus, including those members of the Black Lives Matter movement, I would argue, to be uber progressive and to be on the closer to the extreme than center of the road. And for that reason, I think that we don't often talk about how and why that is. I think there are a young generation among the African American community who are tired of kind of the middle of the road scraps in politics and really want to see some radical change happening. Now, who are they going to vote for or whether or not they're going to actually go to the polls is the interesting question. I think that all of our panelists have highlighted here. Even though you're out marching in the streets, is that going to translate into your actual vote being cast? Because there are people who are supporters of the Black Lives Movement who are very much like, what's the point of me casting my ballot? And who really would rather stay home and continue marching in the streets. And so what does that mean for our electoral politics as well?
Yeah, and I mean, it'd be interesting also it's also interesting to hear some insights from sort of the vanguard of the 1960s civil rights movement. I'm thinking of John Lewis before he passed away, who almost was speaking about, structural impediments to voting and thinking that those battles had been won, and then concerned that new obstacles were being placed in terms of voter ID laws, or, hours of polling places, or things, or, absentee ballot regulations, things like this, and that in some ways the older battles seem to be coming back, and that generation of leadership having a different view of the importance of voting as a method for enacting change. So
yeah, absolutely,
we're seeing a little bit of that. Okay, so we're going to have one more question from the audience, and then I have a final question for the panel before we wrap up. And Lori, this was one that I think was prompted by your comment about our broken primary process.
Okay.
So I guess the question is, if you break it, can you fix it? So the question is, how would you fix it?
Well, there are a lot of different options, I think, that have been out there for a while. One just deals with the calendar, and maybe we need to push back some of the early primary contests. Again, Iowa and New Hampshire used to occur late March and even into April. I'm not sure that we are served well by having them be in January or very early February, because that just extends the length of the campaign, which means then it extends the cost of the campaign. So we're still focusing so much on raising money and that momentum process that's going on in the campaign. So just shortening the campaign might be one thing we could do. Maybe, do we want to consider a national primary to have all of the contests on the same day? There used to be kind of a proposal out there where we could do more of a regional primary and say, okay, here's an 8-week period, and there are 4 regions of the country, and we're going to go every 2 weeks. We're going to do one region of the country, and then randomly swap that out every 4 years. I mean, there are some decent proposals out there that we might want to consider. The problem is we need to get both parties on the same page about this, because this is not something that Congress can regulate, because there's nothing in the Constitution about giving Congress authority to set primary elections or the role of political parties, because you're not going to find anything in the Constitution about that. So yeah, I mean, other than that, just getting the news media to provide more substantive coverage, less on the horse race and some of the things that they do. I don't know how to force that, but maybe we need to have a national conversation about that.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on the primary process? How we select candidates? No? Yeah, okay. All right, so here's the final question for everyone, which is, as a sort of wrap up, what's something you've learned today or that you'll take away from your fellow panelists in terms of comments that were made? I think we like to emphasize facts as a conversation, and that we're not just talking, but we're listening. And so I feel like I've already, gathered lots of new information and thoughts from the conversation. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what you're going to take away. So maybe we'll start with Chris.
Chris, want to start?
Is that all right?
Oh, Chris or Carissa? Who'd you start with?
Oh, I said Chris. Sorry, I did say Chris.
I learned a lot. I thought it was really interesting. I think that I would say the 2 things I heard today that were the most surprising, in terms of I had not heard them before, and I'm interested. I'm going to be looking up things about them, are what Joel had to say about the importance of the suburbs and the changing characteristics of the suburbs, and what he had to say about the fact that wealthy donors are turning, the wealthy are turning more and more towards the Democratic Party. I've seen that with wealthy Democratic Party, but seen it more as they are sort of these interesting examples we point to. I didn't know if it was part of a wider trend versus it makes news when a big wealthy donor endorses someone. If that's part of a wider trend, that's really just interesting to me as a shift that I'll be looking into. So that was the thing I found most surprising.
Thanks. All right. Well, Carissa, since I'm starting with the C's.
I would echo Chris's comments, but I would also add to that I was actually really interested in learning more about what John had to say about evangelicals, and the fact that we so often think of them as a monolith and that they just vote one way and this is the reason, and to think about it a little bit more broadly going forward was something that I really appreciated.
Great. All right. Joel.
Basically, I learned a lot. What I really loved is the fact that we talk about nuance. I think this is the thing that I think we got. Suburbs are not what they were. That's one thing. But I was very interested in the comments about African Americans because I do a lot of work in the African American community myself, both here and in Texas. And, there's all sorts of different points of view. We have to remember that January, had there not been COVID, Hispanics and African Americans would have had the best year they had had economically in about 20. The COVID destroyed Trump's argument, basically. So I thought that was really interesting. And then the changes among evangelicals, I'm finishing something on that. And what's interesting to me is to hear what you're saying about evangelicals, because the one that I've done the most work in, which is my own community, Jewish community, the one part of the Jewish community that's growing is Chabad and the more Orthodox, and the Reform is going down. So this shift within religious groups, people would say all Jews are liberals. Maybe not so much anymore. More Jews are Orthodox. And of course, the Russians and the Persians tend to be conservative. So, this idea of nuance, I think, is something that hopefully we as a university can bring out to people. That they understand that, these sort of mega, statements really may not be true, and that we can learn by understanding the nuance.
Excellent. Great. That's why we ask the experts, right? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, kind of continuing on the same theme, I thought Carissa's remarks on not treating the African-American electorate as a monolith were very revealing, and it reminded me that there's some recent research on younger Black voters being more secular, and there's some evidence to suggest that that's making them sort of fraying their ties to the Democratic Party, which seems to have functioned partly through religion in the past. So I'm very glad you brought that up, because it reminded me that this is something I want to look into going forward.
Great. All right, Lori.
Well, hearing Carissa talk about, the same thing about how Black voters are not monolithic, or hearing Joel talk about, how suburban voters are playing such a huge role, is just a reminder that we need to stop just assuming that there's just one category that we all fall into. One of my most common lines over the last several years is that women are not a monolithic voting bloc. And so I think that, just hearing, I'm reminded of, that's not the only way to look at this. We need to look at it across the board. Also, hearing Chris talk about, the fear among Americans really got me thinking about one of the most important keys of this election in the next few weeks, and what happens on election night is going to be the legitimacy of this election, and how the American people are going to view what happens on election night, especially if we do not have a clear winner on that. And, it'll be viewed differently depending on someone's partisan viewpoint, all these demographic categories that we fall into as individuals. But I think that's going to be the most important thing that we should focus on as a country over these next few weeks, with all of the many, many stories that are going to continue to play out.
Yeah, I think perhaps, one of the things we're all the most afraid of at the moment, besides COVID, is perhaps election night. So yeah. We'll see how that plays out. Well, I just want to thank everybody. This has been such an enriching conversation. I think we've had many questions that we did not have a chance to answer, but I think some of the panelists will do their best to answer them after the fact. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom to do the closing. And thank you very much for tuning in.
Great. Well, thank you, Jennifer. You really did a great job moderating an excellent panel. This was really a fascinating conversation. It was a great format, lots of great questions from our attendees. Also, thank you so much. I think this all reminds us of our important civic duty of voting too. So you tuning in, listening to the issues, I think kudos to you. Have a great weekend, everybody. I have special thanks to Terrence Stroop and Pamela Ezel for working in the background. This was recorded, so we'll post it on our website afterwards. And the final thing I will say, we're continuing these types of conversations on really important issues. Joel, who was on the meeting today, he's going to be on again on October 17th, talking about middle class issues. So look for that. And then October 27th, we're going to have Dean Janine Hill is going to be moderating a discussion on mental health. So look forward to those. We're going to have a busy October. It's going to be a busy October for everybody. So thanks. Stay safe and well, and have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.